This is Jody Tropiano, the Content Director for Health, and I'm here with Bash Parasuraman, Vice President at Pfizer, and Manisha Gulati, Chief Operating Officer at Clarify Health. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
So you both recently participated in a Health Go Live webinar series called Rearchitecting the Drug Launch Model. And during that discussion, we really zeroed in on the incentives for regulators, payers, providers, patients, which are often at odds with each other when it comes to drug launches. So just to dig a little bit deeper into that discussion, first I'll pose a question to Bash. During the webinar, you pointed out that it's time for stakeholders across our industry to shift the way that we're thinking about the value of a therapy. So at Pfizer, how are you innovating on the value story for new drugs that come to market?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that I'd stated during the webinar is we at Pfizer and across the industry, we need to move away from volume-based agreements to value-based agreements. And we need to be convinced and we need to share the data on the value of our treatments. And that process starts very, very early in the development process. So a few things that we have started to do at Pfizer as we look pretty much in the early portfolio, even sometimes before medicines are being tested in humans, when we're looking at disease areas of interest, we are investing heavily in real world data. We've also had some partnerships with Clarify Health in some early disease areas there we are investigating, whether it's in a part of a business development type of an opportunity, whether it's our own early pipeline. We look at various things like what's the payer mix, where does the patient go for treatment, where are the patients located geographically, are there adherence issues just in the overall care of the patient, what are some patient needs, what is the quality of life as defined by the patient. That really helps us to get a holistic story on the different elements of value that need to be captured as we begin to think about how we want to engage with payers and providers as we go downstream into the development program. And those include areas like talking to patients about elements of quality of life, activities of daily living. Are there EMR data sources? Are there surveys that we can scientifically use to capture those data alongside claims data? So once we kind of get a good picture around the patient journey, the disease area, the areas of unmet needs, the total cost of care, the inefficiencies in the healthcare system, that helps us to design our clinical trials better as early as phase 1B, phase 2, test instruments, PROs in those trials. And then we engage with payers, we engage with patient organizations to define our phase 3 program. And throughout that process, one thing that we've begun to do is continue to enrich either the trial data or the insights that we're bringing into designing the trials in conversations we have with payers, with providers, and also with patient groups. And last but not the least, we also keep a laser focus on access and affordability. As you may know, that things like prior auth, step therapies create a burden at the provider level. And how are providers going to react to those barriers? It's easy to say, we just don't want to deal with it because it brings administrative burden to their practices, especially as we're dealing with COVID right now, telemedicine. And how could we solve for that as we design systems around hubs and providing patient assistance, providing provider assistance, etc. So those are sort of examples of how we are using either real world evidence or we're using insights from providers, patients, and even from payers to test target profile, product profiles to then design our clinical trials.
And you touched on this a bit, but any other ways that when you're conveying that value story to your payer and provider partners that you make sure it's objective?
Yes, I think the reason I think value-based agreements have not really been a success yet is because they're complex. It's a lot to kind of agree on, and then we've got to have third parties to adjudicate the data. The data is missing, or it's got interpretation issues. Then it becomes hard to agree on a VBA. And we've seen examples where some VBAs can start with this, this pilot between a company and a payer, but then they don't go forward. So I think having objective endpoints like hospitalizations, like mortality, like in the case of cures, we've seen good examples from Kymriah as an example. We are seeing examples from some of the early gene therapies that are coming out. They're thinking about VBAs. We absolutely have to make sure that if they're objective, there's an incentive and a trust between, at least at the bare minimum, between payers and biopharma. And the trust has to be aligned around metrics like reducing the total cost of care. That's an objective measure. Improving clinical workflow. So, barriers to patient care becomes a burden to providers, it's a burden to patients. Improving adherence, and ultimately improving outcomes that are objective. And that could be costs, hospitalizations, it could be like 6-minute walk test. That also could be an objective marker. So those are metrics, again, that need to be considered. Haven't fully been baked yet, but I think that's the direction we need to go to.
So Manisha, we'll throw it to you. How do you think that pharma and biotech companies could use real-world data to prepare and monitor for the launch of a new therapy?
Yeah, Bosch actually mentioned a lot of the areas. What we see as being really successful, there are a number of areas leading up to launch where real-world data can be very successful. So one, as Bosch pointed out, is moving all the way back to the clinical trial. So we talked about the different kinds of data, but an example for an organization that we're working with is specifically on inclusion and exclusion criteria for their clinical trials, right? They knew from KOL interviews and others what the general type of profile was, but until they actually used the analytics and the real world data to quantify each of the exclusion criteria and how many patients that dropped out of their target that they wanted to recruit for the clinical trials, they actually realized they were excluding a far bigger number of patients than they would have realized. And once they took that broader holistic look. And that allowed them to then narrow the exclusion criteria from just pain more broadly to very specific types of pain to help them recruit the type of patients that they needed, right? So there's a lot you can do in the trial space preparing. The second part is around patients. And one area where people are using real world data a lot, and we see that as well, is in trying to find patients who are misdiagnosed, right? So if you look backwards in the patient's journey, what are the things that are happening to those patients? What are the touch points they're having with the system, and that journey to then be able to reach backwards and find those patients sooner, and prepare for the launch such that you're able to do that in a scalable way. But there's also the things like patient assistance and thinking about non-clinical factors of your patient profile. So social and behavioral determinants of health we think are really important. Another example from a pharma company that we're working with is they actually are launching an infusion therapy that's competing against an oral. But actually when they took their very specific target patient profile and found those patients and mapped them, they actually found that 50% of the patients didn't live in a county where there was going to be an infusion therapy center available to them. So that would make it extremely hard to compete because patients aren't going to drive 40 miles for an infusion when they have an alternative that's an oral. So what that caused them to do is to then think more critically about, and broaden the number of hospitals where they're offering that infusion, to think about access in a different way in preparing for the launch, right? Bosch also mentioned pay for value, and we talked about this on the panel. We share the view that we hope that we move towards more pay for value in the system, but you need real world data to be able to do that. You need to be able to understand how many patients end up in the emergency room, how many get hospitalized, and for how long. But even smaller things for example, our analytics was looking at knee surgery in patients that are getting a specific therapy, and that biotech company found that patients that get their therapy, if you look longer term from that, they actually had less opioids prescribed to them over time than what the standard of care was. So that helped them not only create the payer value story about the cost of those opioids, but that's a real patient value story too, about reduced pain and using that as a proxy for pain going forward as a value of that therapy. So, being able to craft that value story with the data is really important. And then I would say the final piece is on the physician side. We didn't talk as much about this, but right now, what do you know about a physician? You know what they're prescribing, maybe the scripts, the kind of total number of patients they're seeing. But to get really specific about tying your target patients to specific doctors and looking at their trends, not just are they switching therapies, but actually what is the patient clinical event that happened within 3 to 4 months of that doctor switching? So you can actually start to get to the root cause of why are they behaving the way they are and making those decisions. And I think that can help with the targeting and messaging strategy that you have at launch to really be able to craft it using not just anecdotal data, but actual quantitative real world data.
And so you mentioned obviously access and addressing SDOH challenges, but what other major challenges are there for companies and how can they increase their rate of success?
Well, I think there are a number of challenges in using real world data today. I mean, the first, which Bosch already mentioned, is the data itself, right? The data is messy, it's fragmented, it's siloed. You're getting prescription data from one place, you're getting patient data from somewhere else. And so it's actually hard to view it in a 360-degree way and also in a longitudinal way. You know, and patients move from payer to payer. We talked about that in the panel too. And so the data itself is messy. But I think on top of that, what makes it challenging is even if you have the data, getting insights out of it is also very difficult because, you know, you have a hypothesis for something that you think might be happening, then you have to, you know, get a third party, run an analysis or do a SQL query. It takes months to get it back. Then you try and probe something else. So it's hard to iterate on your hypotheses or to see what's happening and then kind of track that over time in an easy way. So I believe the insights part is really hard. Mm-hmm. And then another big challenge, which is, you know, is the trust issue. So you know, once you have data, even if you're using real world data, does the payer trust it? Is it representative of their population? Does the health system trust it if they need to do something differently or a clinician needs to administer, you know, a gene therapy in a way that's different than before? So all of those things I think are real challenges. And, you know, at Clarify, we're attempting to address those challenges, right? To enable pharma companies and biotech companies to be more successful. Mm-hmm. So, you know, from a data point of view, you know, we integrate the data. So we have 300 million lives of patient level data where we take those social factors, the clinical factors, lab values, and put them together so you can see that full picture longitudinally. And then it's in a software, so you can iterate that over time. So what we're trying to do with the software is to help companies to say, okay, let me double click on that and actually see why that's happening. Oh no, you know, that factor is not relevant. Let me actually look at it this way or cut it a different way. I want to look at not just all AML patients, but patients who've completed first-line therapy with these 3, you know, types of drugs. What happens to those patients? And so we're trying to make it more iterative and hypothesis-driven. And then on the trust piece, you know, that's a big challenge to tackle. But the little piece we're trying to chip away at is on the kind of opening the black box and the transparency. Because we work with not just pharma and biotech companies, but also payers and providers. Mm-hmm. And working across those segments, it's also really important, even, for example, between payers and providers, to be able to say, it's not a black box. You can double click. You can see which of your patients are represented and you can see those trends. And so we're trying to make it more of an independent view. And there's still a long way to go to get to the full set of like universally agreed upon standards for how do you measure quality and cost and things like that. But that's the angle that we're taking to enable all the types of the stakeholders in the healthcare system to be able to see that.
So Bosch, I'll throw it back to you. In 5 years from now, how do you hope that our industry will have advanced in the way that we measure and deliver value for new therapies to the different parts of the healthcare ecosystem?
I think what I hope what's going to happen 5 years from now is what Manisha touched upon. The data becomes better. The data becomes more integrated. There is a trust issue that providers and payers and biopharma are willing to share data. And while there are disparate systems still, they're still disaggregated. There is technology coming out like in having platforms that share, they call distributed data networks, so you can kind of start putting pieces together. One of the examples I'll share with you, the work that we've done with Clarify Health with Manisha's group is around in the area of TTR cardiomyopathy, which is it's a form of cardiomyopathy that's related, that happens because of amyloid deposits in a patient's heart. Some patients have a genetic component that leads to TTRCM. For some people, majority of the patients, it's mostly age-related. And so they're difficult to diagnose. These patients go through a difficult diagnostic journey. And when you look at the end-to-end total cost of care, which you would think is simple enough to measure, it's a challenge because some of these patients may have had this symptoms of heart failure before they turn 65. So they're in one data set. And then when they come to Medicare data set, they're still going through that journey. And ultimately, some of them do get diagnosed, some of them may not get sadly diagnosed. But the entire journey in terms of tracing it across different data systems, tracing it, bringing together the EMR data is challenging. So, one of the things that we've started doing is let's look at the ICD-10 code when the patient was diagnosed, and let's look back at 10-year history. And then it's very hard to get the 10-year history for that patient, but as far back we can go. And that portion, pre-diagnosis, is really a marker of inefficiency that adds to the total cost of care. So when medicines like Vyndaqel, for example, comes out, there's a lot of concerns, questions around the price of the medicine and what the cost offsets are. And typically what we do within a trial is we look at hospitalizations, we look at ER, we look at mortality, we do a cost effectiveness model, we do a budget impact model, but that's only part of the cost. What's not included is the total end-to-end cost. So that's just an example of where, by bringing together different data sets, by looking at the, a picture that's much more longitudinal in nature, by, having data partners work together from 5 years from now, I think there would be, solutions to kind of deliver value for new therapies that's going to bring together payers, providers, and the biopharma industry together. And what it could lead to, hopefully, if this partnership exists, the trust element gets better, is we could, alongside the data sharing, we need to do alignment around how the data adjudication is going to take place. Would it be a third party, an analytics company that does the data adjudication? Do we employ artificial intelligence or techniques so we can remove subjectivity? Do we tie performance measures to actual payments? So we set up milestone-based payments for gene therapies, which are going to be in the multi-million-dollar ranges, and brings affordability issues, system affordability issues into the picture. How do we agree on performance metrics for, say, hemophilia gene therapy, and not look at it plan by plan, because that creates risks for the payers, it creates risk for the biopharma industry, because it's not a lot of patients that's going to do it. We absolutely have to be able to pool data together and look at outcomes more at a population level. And then ultimately, I think, having any kind of digital type of technology to be able to either manage the cost of care or even be able to, prevent a negative outcome. And an example of this is the collaboration Pfizer has had with Fitbit to offer Fitbits to patients who got AFib, and then using the Fitbit data that goes to a third-party website, be able to track when patients are at risk of an AFib, and therefore they get a warning to kind of go to the hospital or contact their physician right away. I think those types of advancements in bringing technology partners, in bringing payers, in bringing analytics companies and biopharma together is going to bring savings to the healthcare ecosystem. And I think definitely providers need to be part of this as well, because they are the ones who are now using, EMR a lot more. And there's a lot more information in the electronic records that could be captured to kind of look at the total cost of care, to look at the outcomes, look at the utilization, and the journey of the patient.
So last question for the both of you, maybe just a quick fire, 30 seconds each. I like to end all these interviews with this question, just what you're most hopeful about for the future. There's a lot of change going on in our industry right now, but what gives you the most hope? Maybe Venetia, we'll start with you.
Well, what gives me the most hope is that we're having this conversation. It's really important that people's mindset shift from, the old school way of doing things to how do we really work together as different parts of the stakeholder, different parts of healthcare to really improve care for patients, but also lower costs. And so I think my hope for us is that we get to a place where we are looking at value in a different way. We're using data in a different way, but that ultimately that's better for the patient, but also more efficient and sustainable for the U.S. healthcare industry.
my hope is that, I think the questions that we hear in our day-to-day lives, whether you turn on the television, there's news about the healthcare costs, pharma costs, is we are able to address that with objective data and responses, because I think there is a gut reaction, there's a subjective reaction when people hear about costs, and the United States is the most expensive healthcare system in the world. And what I'm hoping for is people like us who are part of the solution. We are trying to come up with solutions where we can give answers, we can give data, we can give solutions, whether it's to our political leaders, whether it's to media, whether it's just social media, however, to educate our people and make decisions that help to manage the healthcare costs. Because as I said before, there are costs upon costs upon costs. And I think the old way of doing things, which are either rebate-based or whether there are protocols being followed because that's the way the system works, we need to kind of walk away from that into how new systems and data particularly can help to manage the costs better and bring optimal treatments to patients earlier.
Excellent. Well, Vash, Manisha, thank you both for joining us today. Thanks for sharing your insight, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jody.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this interview. We're doing our best to keep our health community up to date and informed as the pandemic progresses. So please check back for more interviews and blog pieces with leading health experts, as well as check out our Health COVID resource page for more information. Thanks again.